Hello and welcome to this ISC press point for the launch of the report for the midterm review of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. My name is Alison Meston and I'm the Director of Communications for the International Science Council. And today I'm pleased to be joined by some of the authors of this report, including Dr. Roger Pulwati, the Senior Scientist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAAS, as part of the Physical Sciences Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. He's one of the co-chairs of the report, along with Dr. Rathana Pio Norbert Munz, who we're hoping will join during the press point. She's not with us at the moment, but we'll hope she'll be joining soon. Dr. Bapon Fukurudun from the water sector, a lead for the Division of the Mitigation and Adaptation at the Green Climate Fund, and Dr. Victor Galez, Deputy Director of the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden. We also have joining us Dr. Alonso Brenz, the Coordinator of the Network for Social Studies on Disaster Risk Prevention in Latin America and the Caribbean. Some housekeeping, this is a Zoom meeting. Please mute your microphones and feel free to pose questions or write comments in the chat area. There'll be time for Q&A at the end. Well, we're halfway through the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which in 2015 set out 7 clear targets and 4 priorities for action to prevent new and reducing existing disaster risks. This report for the midterm review of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction has been produced by the UN Major Group on Science and Technology and convened by the International Science Council. It highlights the barriers to and examples of best practice of improved disaster risk reduction around the world. First, let's share a message from the President of the ISC, Peter Gluckman. I'll ask Zhenya to share that. So Peter Gluckman says this midterm review urgently recommends a rethink of how risk science informs decision making. Sorry, can I just ask people to mute? Thank you. Decision making supported by early warning systems, disaster monitoring and evidence-based risk government. We also have the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Mami Mizutori, who also says this report is a timely reminder that science-based solutions exist but must be urgently integrated into public policy if we are to make ground on fulfilling the Sendai Framework by 2030. The report comes alongside the Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas and the Caribbean, convened by the Government of Uruguay and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Today, we're going to reveal that, sadly, the world is set to miss UN targets for preventing disasters by 2030, with the magnitude and impact of disasters on lives, livelihoods, and ecosystems on the rise worldwide. We have 11 key messages to share with you, ranging from nature-based solutions helping to address environmental degradation to mental health issues caused by disasters must be addressed, to issues around financing risk reduction to avoid the rising costs of post-disaster recovery. Our key messages also include having better multi-hazard warning systems, to better communication must be improved to talk about the prevention of risk creation. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to see these recommendations, and you can also see these recommendations in our report. I don't think Dr. Rathana Norbert Munz is with us right now, so I am going to bring in Dr. Roger Pulwati, who is currently at the Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Uruguay. Roger, if I can bring you in, and if you can unmute your microphone, and if Zhenya can stop sharing the slides. Oh no, Rathana's here. Oh, fantastic. Rathana, welcome. If you could take your camera on and unmute yourself. You're on mute as well. Could we just check that you're wonderful? Well, welcome. Let's start with you. On the On the backdrop of human-made disasters through conflict, along with the increasing weather-related events through the climate emergency, can you just tell us the initial thoughts on the findings of the midterm review for the Sendai framework?
Good morning. Good evening.
Rithana, I'm afraid our connection is not very good.
I think you say it already. It is sad.
Rithana, can I suggest you turn off your video and just speak with us? We'll see if this goes well, and if not, we might have to. Yeah, let's see if we can hear you.
Urgent as well that we address what is currently happening. We are off track. Okay, if you cannot hear it, perfect. Is it better now, or
it is definitely better now with the video off? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, better. All right. So just coming like in and very quickly about it, I think superb. So I think one of the is really to see that we are off track developments, but we are not maximizing enough the resources. We are not yet implementing a governance system of risk that we urgently need to put. And I think, again, if there's two keywords here is getting back on track and looking at a system of risk instead of just a part of it.
You're passionate about risk governance, and you mentioned this very quickly, and you're saying that we need to have risk governance and management acting today for tomorrow. I mean, this is a crucial issue given, for example, the earthquake and loss of life that we've had in Turkey and Syria in the last few weeks. What have been some of the major positive developments under the Sendai framework that we can improve on risk reduction and risk management along these issues?
Well, I think when we think about risk governance, we're not looking at just one aspect of it. We really have to look at the time horizon that is really long term. And I think you can't change the past, but everything you do today can change the futures. And that's really like what we think about risk governance 15 related to the Sendai framework. We can look at an increased access to information, to data, to knowledge around risk. And that significant increase of awareness at multi-level, not only at global level, but as well at national level, at subnational level, those are very positive trends. And even the member state of the midterm review analyzed that, and 93% of them indicate that during the consultation that there is improvements of risk information and management. Now, it is you have better data that you take better decision, or that you have better action. And I think this is really the critical link here between informed-based decision-making process. You can't plan for everything, but you have to plan for possible full positive trends that we can see, but we need to do that in a more systematic way.
I think we might have lost Rithana, so we have to, speaking of risk, that is one of the risks we take of having Rithana, it's very difficult to hear you, so I'm going to move to Roger. So if I can bring Roger in. Roger is joining us from the very big meeting in Montevideo right now. There's 700 people attending the meeting there. Roger, welcome. We've also got some gremlins where you are. So what is the key message coming through?
Sorry, we're getting the wrong kind of feedback.
Yeah, we are getting the wrong kind of feedback.
Can't hear you, Alison.
You can't hear?
On mine?
Yeah, you'll need to turn up your...
Where is it? I don't use
if someone could assist Alonso so that the... Okay, Roger, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, lovely.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So can you tell us what the mood is like at the Montevideo Disaster Risk Reduction Conference? And what is the message coming through about us being halfway through the Sendai framework? What are the clear messages coming out on disaster risk reduction?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I'm glad you phrased it as the mood, because mood spelled backwards is doom. And the idea is not one of doom. The idea is that many achievements have been made relative to education and health, and certainly the ability to use early warnings to save lives. But in that context, what the report and the feeling of the room is how can we, in fact, do more with what we already know, since so much is known? And then what prevents us from acting on that knowledge? That is really the subtext for a lot of what's going on at the meeting right now. Yes, there's the question of finance, there always is, but we should be financing the right things. And this is actually an effort to reduce the incentives for how risk is created around the world. So that feeling is here, the notion of financing, the notion of collaboration at different levels and regions. As you heard from Ratana and others, the issue of not just having building codes, but the compliance and the enforcement behind that. But most critically, the feeling and the knowledge, it's an informed feeling that without broadening the network of actors to more broadly include women, indigenous people, and others, we will not be making just transitions in a globally connected world. We know we're connected. We know that happens in different ways, but we actually, within the report and here, ask the question, in addition to Sendai, in addition to the Sustainable Development Goals, in addition to the Paris Agreements, how do we ensure that we're actually getting back on track, as was just mentioned, and that's what was said. Now, what we try to do in the report and in this meeting is ask the question, not just let's rediscover that connectedness matter or rediscover that partnerships matter, but what has been stopping us from acting on that knowledge? And that's the feeling here. So you're hearing a lot of cases and examples, and the authors on the report represent not just single disciplines. They represent, if you press on the name Victor Galaz or Alonso Brenes, Ratana, or Pilar Cornejo, who just joined, you will open up a world of knowledge and partners. So they represent a very broad group. The feeling here is that we're acknowledging that impacts are systemic. They go from one scale to the other. We're acknowledging that early warning matters, provided it leads to action. But most critically, we're coming face to face with the fact that how we govern knowledge and risk is actually not at odds with the changing, is actually at odds, with the changing complexity of the world. We are drawing down and depleting our natural buffers, and we're asking in the report and at this meeting how to create early warning that includes those. If in fact it's true that without stronger efforts on biodiversity protection, that we will not meet 80% of the Sustainable Development Goals, that is a lesson for us. But that doesn't mean it translates into action.
There's a very clear narrative that's building from this report and from the mood, and let's not use the word doom, but from the mood where you are, what the message for journalists and policymakers, and also the private sector, that early warning systems for natural disasters and investing in risk reduction saves lives and saves money in the future. So what are the steps that we can take to mitigate these risks and build this resilience and do more partnering with decision makers in the private sector?
Yeah, so as you know, we tend not to use the phrase natural disasters simply because it's a disaster occurs when an event overwhelms the human capability to respond. So it's a disaster, not necessarily naturally driven, so to speak. From that standpoint, we outline in the document, and Bapon Fakruddin and others have done a lot of work on how we create much more people-centered efforts. And some key areas are in defragmenting in the financing to support not just proactive action, but prospective action, the action that does not let new risks arise. When we talk about it in the report, we mentioned that the issue of being proactive, which is X is likely to happen, how do we respond? But when we think of things like climate change and we think of issues like that, it's not simply one of responding to climate change, but acting so as not to let the changes happen that are negative. That's a prospective view. So when we think through this, and there's a good question on the last mile. I want to mention when we talk about early warning down to the last mile, it is also important to get capabilities up from the last mile. So I'm hesitant to use ever down to the last mile because capabilities are in fact up from people's actions at the local level. That being said, we have to understand that there's no one scale at which all things can be solved. Local is important, but so many of our local risks are driven by global actions. Whether it's COVID or a war or a global drought on food supply issues. So that link is more and more clear in this report and among the authors. And the effort is to really bring in the private sector, but to understand the role of the private sector. We tend to have idealized notions of what government can do, what private sector can do, what civil society can do. And yet it is a collaborative mechanism to understand what really is the role of the private sector when equity is the goal. And so we need to make sure we're balancing the civil society needs with what the private sector can provide so that a just transition and equity occurs, not just the solutions for those who are most technologically sophisticated.
Thanks, Roger. Well, sitting next to you is Alonso Brenz, and I'm wondering if we could move over to Alonso Brenz, and move over to the computer over to him. And perhaps, you as coordinator of the Network for Social Studies on Disaster Risk Prevention in Latin America and the Caribbean, perhaps you could give a regional perspective on some of the issues that Ratana and Roger have already raised.
Yeah. You have to.
Alonso, it would be better if you stayed at the computer where. Okay.
We fix it. We fix it.
Okay, you fixed it. This is the beauty and joys of doing online in the same room.
Yeah. Hi. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining the presentation. From the point of view of our regional perspective in Latin America and the Caribbean, I would like to emphasize the challenge that we still face in terms of enhancing the interface between the scientific knowledge and the scientific production of analysis and data and technical recommendations. The ideal pathway is that all this information and knowledge the scientific community is generating influence the decision-making processes in terms of adjusting the underlying risk drivers that are behind the landscape of disaster that you can see in Latin America in our countries. This is a topic that had been on the table. I'm participating in the discussions around 20 years ago, and from the first meeting I was in, that was the one of the key challenges, and it is still a very key challenge today. So it makes you wonder why we are a scientific community and are missing the target of communicating and enhancing this interface. It's not only our responsibility, we have that clear, it's a collective work. It's a very long, it's a long process because we are facing cultural changes because it's from the grassroots of citizenship that they will eventually demand from decision makers to enhance specific policies in terms of cutting environmental degradation or reducing inequality and enhancing institutional reaction and capacities that at the end are the bedrock of disaster risk in not only here in Latin America, but worldwide. I think one of the key challenges in that regard, because this is not something that is a problem alone with disaster risk management or climate change adaptation for that matter. It always has been one of the key challenges when you produce science and try to push through the enhancing of life conditions of the population and the broader audiences. It happens in the 50s. It happens at the beginning of the 20th century. It's always the very same challenge. And when you see the structural transformations, taking history as a master, you see that the critical tipping point in this speeded up of the impact of science in the public sphere is when the citizenship got the message and start to demand into the decision makers that act accordingly to what evidence is providing. You can find a lot of nice examples with the load and the pains in the States, the tobacco discussion, the fossil fuels. So I think we have to be more we have to be more increase the emphasis on how to spread the message to the broader audience. And because this in the long run will be the guarantee that the message will remain and will be more pervasive in terms of the collective demands to the politicians. Until we don't hit that point, I think we're still going to be facing and accumulating frustration, so to speak, and the results and the impacts will be not a satisfactory thing. So I'll straight as a critical thing and an articulation for the agenda, at least in Latin America, and I think it also applies for other parts of the world. I think this is one of the aspects when we have to focus on in the future.
Thank you for that, Alonso. And I think what you raise about the citizenry and how we deal with citizen voices is a very good way to bring in Dr. Victor Galaz. So if Victor could come in and we could spotlight Victor, because Victor's work at the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden has expertise around responding to the rapidly changing global risk landscape. And Victor, you're passionate about ensuring vulnerable people have a voice, and this is what Alonso was just alluding to. Our report finds that displacement of people after various hazards happen, after disaster strikes, has a devastating effect on people, but especially vulnerable groups. And for example, in destination areas, unmanaged population flows lead to overcrowding, social tensions, limited access to service and housing, and affects livelihoods and so on. So what's your message to policymakers on how we anticipate the movement of populations and minimise inequalities when we think about the rising instances of ongoing hazards and risks?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you fine.
Good afternoon from Stockholm. It's a big question, but I think I would like to start with observation. And I think it's become quite clear that many countries around the world have failed to secure safe and legal migration routes to those who need it. We see it in Europe, we see it in Latin America, and I'm just mentioning two examples. And I think there needs to be a bigger recognition that we need to help people to move from danger and poverty to safety and comfort. And disaster preparedness, resilience is key, right? So we're failing now, and we need to realize that the needs will just grow over time. So in that context, I think there are two key messages that I see being important here. First of all, a need to see the benefits of disaster prevention and resilience building to minimize the risks on these communities, especially if they feel forced to migrate. I think just that type of preventive action, it runs through the whole report that we're presenting, and to see that need to target these particular communities. But also as a second point, since some of these impacts will not be able to, it will be difficult to prevent them. And I think it might make sense to talk more about mobility rather than migration. and as an adaptation opportunity to people. And so governments need to continue to develop, but also enforce national and cross-border strategies to manage climate and disaster-related migration. And it needs to be done in ways that respect human rights and that address humanitarian needs. So I think there is an ambition, there is a big discussion about these topics, of course, in the policy domain, in the UN system, but I think there is a lack of enforcement. And again, to respect and to respond to humanitarian needs and respect human rights, migrants.
And again, this issue in our report keeps coming up about finance and how finance can be deployed to contribute to build resilience. So how do we shift the focus from a post-disaster response to a more anticipatory and preventative action?
I think, again, that the reports make that very clear, right? So just putting that topic at the center of discussion, that humanitarian reactive responses will not be enough. There needs to be an emphasis on reducing disaster risks, since we're moving into a new planetary reality, getting that up front and getting that very clear. Another important observation, I think, in the report, and it was mentioned previously by one of the previous speakers, is that just reducing the funding and subsidies to activities that undermine resilience, that we know undermine resilience, that erode natural capital, or even destroy natural capital, or that contribute to increased emissions of fossil fuel emissions. I think that is also part of the story. It's not just about boosting investment in resilience, but also removing investments that we know are creating harm already and increasing harm already. And I think a last point also coming out very clearly from the report are just the benefits of investing in proactive action, right? So I think the numbers that a 1 trillion investment in making infrastructure more resilient in developing countries would generate a benefit of $4.2 trillion US. So there is, even though it might seem like a cost in the short term, the long-term benefits are quite big.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? It's convincing those who are in decision-making roles that to spend early means that we don't have to spend so much later on, and we're actually building that resilience from the beginning. And yes. I think this is a good time now to bring in Dr. Bapon Fakudrun from the Green Climate Fund. Bapon, you're a specialist on issues around water, and I mean, we're just about to head into a major UN water conference taking place in New York in the next few weeks. Let's hear your views on, for example, some of the adaptation projects that you've been involved in around water and climate, and how the projects you've been involved in is saving lives and livelihoods. If we keep hearing this in our report that we're undervaluing nature. So if we valued nature more, how does this affect the resilience of saving lives and livelihoods in the future?
Thank you so much, Alison. That's one of the critical points you actually raise. I mean, coming from New Zealand, if you look at our Tia Maori or our indigenous knowledge, that provides us a quite strong message that everything is integrated, our past, our present, our future, as well as our earth, ocean, and water. Everything is interconnected and interrelated. And we have a strong value for our individuals, our families, our leaders. So that means which again actually reflects that an engagement and interconnectedness. And I think if you look at the globally, that is actually the missing part still. We still love to work as a silos, as an independent and coordination mechanism. We are talking about it, but in principle, when it comes to an operational level, there is actually very lack of coordination and cooperation. And unless we come up with that kind of agreement and solution and integrated and engagement, strong bonding, this kind of emerging problem, which is actually due to climate change, disaster, as well as other scarcity, is not going to solve the problem. While we were actually writing this report, we didn't actually knew that there is one more actually the commitment framework has been issued in last COP15 in Montreal, which is very recently in this year, which is like Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that also quite highly ambitious to come up with. Actually, they like to reduce the by 30% of the earth land, ocean, coastal areas, and inland water. They want to reduce 500 billion annual harmful government subsidies, as well as cut food waste 50%. But how? Unless we actually look at all these frameworks, now we have actually 5 major frameworks that are chasing about 2030, Sendai, SDG, Habitat 3, Paris Agreement, and then Montreal. So how actually we can actually bring them into one cohesive, integrated manner, that is actually quite important. We also work quite strongly to linking not only just the vertical integration, because when you talk about the integration, we try to link up global, regional, national to local, but you need to also look at the horizontal aspect, your domain. So we need to think about how this meteorological or atmospheric domain working and how the water resource management domain working, how the climate change domain working, how the then your ocean actually working. So unless all this service provider doesn't work together, we'll not be able to achieve a sustainable solution for our community to make it resilient.
And you're really there talking about, SDG 17, how everything needs to be linked. And again, one of the findings in our report is that we need more transdisciplinary science. We need to bring those voices together so that we're acting not in silos, but bringing all of these different aspects together in order to build resilience for the future.
Absolutely. And also, you saw actually there has been one of the good part on disaster risk reduction or climate change field is that you have a very strong advocacy partner who are actually quite strongly try to advocate this kind of initiatives. But the number of disaster increasing, the number of drastically the dynamic situation happening into atmosphere, land and ocean and coastal, we are not able to actually chasing them in the right pace. But also there is a strong gaps into the operational domain, because you can talk in your whole day, whole life, but you need to do something at the ground. So who are the player in the ground? Very active, doing something, taking some action. That is also quite important. We have some good initiatives like the early warning system for all, which has been laid out. And now we need to actually work on how we actually develop a proper plan to making sure that you saw that the report also describes that 50% of the country doesn't have actually a multi-hazard early warning system. So that's a massive, drastic activities we have to take together to ensuring the country who doesn't have any warning system at all, how we can actually provide them some basic fundamental so that they can ensure they're saving people's lives and livelihood. At the same time, some people who are actually having the system, how that could be further enhanced to reducing their disaster-related losses.
And in fact, Bapon, we just had a recent call by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, saying that every citizen worldwide should be protected by early warning systems against extreme weather and climate change. What would we need to do to meet this ambition?
Yeah, that's why I said this is a very highly ambitious vision. But as we have that kind of political, the blessings, I would say, it's better. It's now we need to drive how actually we can achieve that goals. Even at least every single population, we cannot reach. How can we reach actually every single nation in the world, have some fundamentals to receiving the early warning systems and act upon it? Because once it goes to the national level, national to the local level, it's a completely different dynamics. It's completely depends on their own territory. As a global scale, we cannot make sure that, yes, we'll be able to reach every single people in the community, but at least if we can ensure that every single country has a basic fundamentals for multi-hazard early warning system, that could ensure that further leading down how actually they could set up those kind of mechanism from national to the local connection.
Thank you, Bapon. Well, look, let's bring it on all our guest speakers. Ratana, I hope you're still there. And Roger and Alonso, you're going to have to be watertight on the way that you interact with each other, being in the same room. while we're waiting for those journalists that are on, if you wanted to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring you into the room. But while we're waiting, one of the key recommendations included how we improve communicating the complexity of risk. For all of you, how do we pilot new ways of communicating risk information and its implications for risk management and sustainable development? So how do we do this through storytelling? Does anyone want to have a go at that question? It looks like there's a lot of activity going on in the room where Alonso and Roger are. Ratana, let's see if we can have your microphone.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
Ratana, you go.
If I may, but I just want to be sure that I can be heard this time.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
All right, blessing on that one. No, so the different way of communicating complexities and change. I think two key aspects here. Time. It requires time. It is not easy to be able to have this analytic mind. It is not easy to translate complex system, and it's not easy to take decision. So time is definitely of essence here. Another element, and that you really see that a lot when we are talking about risk governance, is about trust. It is not because you have more data that you think that you're maybe a better institution than another one, that people are going to follow you. And I think trust is actually behind a lot of what Roger was saying. What is the current barrier that we have when we're thinking about risk governance? And it's actually an emotion. It's about the trust to your government, the trust to your data. And I think it's come again to what Alonso brings, the citizenship.
Thank you, Ratana. There's a good question coming from Tushar Padran. He asks, with regards to small island and developing states, is there an anticipated migration policy in the wake of sea level rise scenario? Does anyone wish to respond to that? I mean, that's obviously a very real situation, Bapon,
Thanks.
also in your region.
That's right. I think that's one of the very critical issue, but also very less research actually has been spent on this migration issue. There's a various source of migration, and migration could be intra-migration, like, within the country, one island to another, or even maybe actually living in a riverside or flood-prone area, how actually you're moving to a different zone. And there could be an international migration, which is actually one country to another. And how you sort those kind of, intra and international migration is still actually quite challenging to sorting out that from where to where, how actually you moved, what are the purpose, and whether that's climate related or that's actually livelihood related or that economic benefit related. So those are the still challenges, but I think there is massive and extensive work is going through, especially with the New Zealand government. MFED is actually funding several research activities to understand better how this intra-migration and inter-migration is happening, and what could be the most achievable solution for this to ensuring those population who are actually in the quite most vulnerable area, how we can actually make them more resilient or make them actually more safer or build back better kind of environment. So those are actually ongoing.
And Victor, come in, and then I'm going to ask Roger to come in because I understand he wants to respond to some of the issues raised in the chat. So let's go to Victor.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on that. And I think it's not just about understanding. I think we need to be very open and blunt about that. There are big political challenges at the moment. I think we're seeing responses from many countries to migration or mobility through criminalization or aggressive restrictions. And I think once we see that happening, that actually undermines resilience, because we know from the evidence that mobility options to people enhance resilience and enhances adaptive capacity. So it's not just a scientific challenge to understand the challenges of migration and mobility, but also very real and harsh political challenges that are acting in conflict to resilience in many regards.
Roger.
Thanks very much. Let's see if I can this. How's that?
We're getting a lot of echo, so somebody needs to turn down their sound on the computer that they're in. Yeah.
Sorry, Alison. Yeah.
That's
so
perfect.
yeah, no, cheers. So there are a couple of questions, and Bapon and Victor certainly address them from the standpoint of Ratana's point. You know, there's an old saying that as scientists, we think the world is made up of particles, but humans are made up of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And from that standpoint, the idea that Victor is raising, that these are in fact not easily solvable in the sense of a knowledge deficit, all we need is one more piece of information, is really a rich point that begs the question, how do we create a narrative amongst ourselves that is based on trust? Now, there are different kinds of trust we talk about in the report, which is, do we trust the information? Do we trust how we're engaged? But there's a much more important type of trust, which is affinitive, which is, why should I believe that you have my interest? And that is a part of the dialogue that we want to get ahead of, without trying to say we need to collect all data before we act. There's another thing in philosophy, the philosophy of science, called the Socratic fallacy, which is, the Socratic fallacy is, if we have to agree on the mechanics of walking before we take a walk, we will never take a walk together. And the idea with that is, we do not need to know a whole lot in order to understand that partnerships matter, that respect matters. And we point that out in the report, using the experience of some tribal communities in the United States and elsewhere, that issues such as reverence and respect play a strong role in whether or not we get people with opposing views to join us in the goals.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big piece here on the SIDS. I do want to point out, being working in the Pacific and also being from the Caribbean, that sea level rise is critical, but water is even more important. In fact, what we're seeing from Victor and Bapon's standpoint, mobility is being derived based on issues surrounding water. So I do want to keep in mind that as we think about the issue of where people go and how, they're not distinct drivers such as let's respond to sea level rise. So that's it's something that we should keep in mind. When it comes to resilience at the local level, I do want to point out, and all of the people on this call represent, the types of people that are not just boundary spanners, but how you embed new capabilities in local communities to help make their own decisions. And that's where the training and transdisciplinary pieces come from. The notion of human dignity is important here. And what's the essence of human dignity? That you can make a decision about your own life.
Yes.
And that's where developing the capabilities, as to get to the last mile question, within the communities, not just communication, but how the norms and practices of local communities are informed by people who are within those communities. That's the capabilities that we're looking for. So I just wanted to add that in, just because when we get back to the private sector component, I do want to get into at least one bit of discussion of how we might reduce the incentives for how risk is being created. So thanks. Cheers.
Thanks. Alonso, did you want to respond to any of that?
No, I think Roger covered.
Okay.
Probably, yeah.
So I do want to pick up on a broader issue that Roger has raised, and again, this is on the notion of resilience, and the report touches on issues around, you know, communicating issues more effectively, but it also talks about the need to have a transdisciplinary response. And I guess my question is about within our scientific systems, our science systems, and when I think about then our communication systems, and I think about the word resilience, and I think about the way, for example, Bapon was talking, Bapon and Victor both talked about rights and rights to information. We have this, for me, an interesting web where the private sector comes in, human rights comes in, our own science systems, when we talk about being transdisciplinary and having voices. Are we in ourselves ready and resilient to meet the needs for resilience in the future? Are our communications systems resilient? And I'm thinking about particularly mis and disinformation that can often happen very quickly and very effectively in the aftermath of an emergency. You know, I'm thinking about making sure that people have, you know, we're at a time when people don't have radios in their houses anymore because everything is plugged into a mobile phone. Basic things, to all the way through to the human rights and people's rights when there are emergencies being taken into consideration. Are we resilient in our science systems? Are we resilient in our communication systems in order to deal with the future resilience needed to prevent and mitigate emergencies? And Roger, I don't want to think about the word doom. I want to think about the word mood.
I was just saying it's doom if we get it backwards.
Yeah.
So, and Ratana, it'd be great to hear.
That's
Yes,
one of the
Ratana, please come in. Oh,
I'm going to
Ratana.
start there. All right. No, we're not. And I think the whole report is about that. We are off track, and especially on that. Looking at the future, learning from the future is not something we do easily. There are more and more efforts, but learning from the future is not happening. Most people are learning from the past, but dynamics have been changing. The world is changing, more volatile, more uncertain. And there is this distance between what we can learn from the past and what we should learn from the future. So we are currently in this moment where the realization of how we take a decision, why we take a decision, and why resilience is for who. I mean, we emphasize about the right to people, leaving no one behind. With Roger, we talk a lot about leaving no ecosystem behind. And this is really about what we are claiming in this report. It is really trying to have this balance between us and the ecosystem and our planet. And I think we are totally failing right now.
Bapon.
Well, I just maybe touch upon one of the critical aspects. If you really want to be resilient, you need to have a sort of baseline data set. And that's where actually one of the biggest gaps we have, and we also quite strongly recommend it out of our 8, that you need to have a good baseline data set, and as well as cross-domain interoperability, because we often actually in the past talk about, okay, data should be into one single system. Data should be stored in one places, but data doesn't talk each other because they are actually different entity. They're different standard, they're different format. So, but with this kind of transdisciplinary mode, with the emerging risk, your data need to be talked with other sector data. They need to have a same standard, same metadata, same ontology. And that's where actually we are actually still having a huge gap.
Right.
CoData has taken a huge initiatives with developing a framework for interoperability. Hope once those are actually in place and published, that could create some of the solution for our scientific community to better deal with data and how those could be interoperable, as well as making sure that those are actually fair principle applied.
And of course, that data needs to be machine readable.
Absolutely.
So major challenges there. Alonso.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I think the experience we have been facing here in Latin America share some lights and to very hoping scenario. I mean, we have facing a paramount challenge in terms of how to deal with the fake news and misinformation currents and these new technological packages that have been a tsunami of in terms of the ways people communicate. But I think we are, as a scientific community, given signs that we are quick learners and we are asking for help to a different community of specialists, the people in media and people specialized in communication techniques. Here in Latin America, we're starting to see this mutual exchange of information and methods and techniques on to how to encapsulate and how to deal better with misinformation, with fake news, and especially in terms of the how manage emergency processes and response. A lot of nice things have going on in the past 3 years, working with people in charge in institutions of how to communicate and how to face these challenges. So I think we have to be more spoke out what we are doing in our regions, because a lot of things interesting are being carried on at this moment. So I feel very enthusiastic about how quickly we are tackling the issue in this moment.
I've just put a link in our chat. We've actually got a webinar tomorrow at the ISC on those very issues, Alonso. So we are critically thinking about this as well. I'm conscious of the time, and we scheduled half an hour for this press point, and we're a bit over, and I think that just shows the enthusiasm that everyone has for these critical issues. So I think it's time to close this session now and thank everybody for their time. But if anyone would like to come in with a last point or a last word, I encourage people to download the new report that's come out, and specifically I encourage people to share this report with the decision makers and the thought leaders in their regions or their localities. There's a lot going on, and the next reports coming out from the ISC are actually also around the water conference coming up. And as we've talked about today, this is all integrated. It's all needs to be taken from a transdisciplinary viewpoint and within the context of the 21st century challenges that we have, particularly around communications. Ratana, would you like to come in and say a last few words?
I don't know. I think it's not last few words. I think it's really like a start of a journey where we realize that there are more to be done. This report again, and as pointed by Roger, it's not just coming from one discipline, one regions. It's really bringing a diverse type of stakeholders that are involved in that domain, that are trying to address those issues and that are trying to test new way of doing better. And I think this is really this positive energy that we can get out of it, while recognizing that a lot need to be done now.
Thank you, Ratana. Wise words. A journey just beginning, and you know, with a very clear voice from the science community saying, you know, we're ready to step up, we're ready to assist. Roger, from your point of view, any last words as a co-author, or first words, as Ratana puts it, first words to the start of the journey?
First words are, we need help and we need your help. So, and thank you.
Alonso.
No, just to say that it was a thrill to be part of this group, and I really enjoy and learn a lot of the whole process. And we now have the task to distribute and widespread the message across the region and try to touch as many audiences as possible in this coming months. So you have a network of allies here in Latin America to spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you. And Victor, from the other end of the globe, over in, oh no, it's Bapon who's in New Zealand. Well, you are over the other end of the globe from Latin America, over in Sweden.
No big words, just thank you. It's been a pleasure engaging with you, and thanks for inviting me to contribute to this report. Thanks.
And Bapon, New Zealand suffering terribly recently from a cyclone. What message do you have for the community?
I think the scientific community laid out a quite strong summary with this huge justification, and we come up with a total 8 concrete recommendations. And this need a political blessings at this moment, because unless it gets a blessings and implemented through the implementing partner, all of our effort, all the science community who actually put days after days of their time, voluntary time on this particular reporting, it will be actually worthless. So I would strongly recommend we spend our time and energy for some better goods. Let's bring it to that level so that it can get some blessings. And some of this recommendation should be implement it in a time frame so that we can get some satisfaction in our career that yes, we identify something and that has been addressed. That's my message to all the community.
Thank you very much, Bapon. And can I thank all the co-authors that are here with us today, and of course the co-authors who were not able to join this session. Thank you for this incredible body of work, which really does set out a challenge to our communities, but a hopeful one, I think, is the main message that is coming from today's discussion. Can I also thank Anne-Sophie Stevens, our Senior Science Officer, who has been behind the coordination of this project. Her colleague, Anda Pavocci, also, lots of work goes on behind the scenes to produce this kind of report from a transdisciplinary voice, from a global voice, and the International Science Council continues to stand ready to be that global voice for and of science as we meet the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Please read the report and share with your community. I thank you and wish you a good day.